You know what's wild? Most people are still overpaying for car insurance just because it's a pain to switch. That's why there's Jerry. Jerry's the only app that compares rates from over 50 insurers in minutes and helps you switch fast with no spam calls or hidden fees. Drivers who save with Jerry could save over $1,300 a year. Before you renew your car insurance policy, do yourself a favor. Download the Jerry app or head to jerry.ai/Libsyn. That's JERRY.ai/LIBSYN.
This is episode 431 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Claire McManus, Professor of English at Northumbria University in Newcastle in the UK, author of Women on the Renaissance Stage and editor of John Fletcher's The Island Princess. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Hamlet wagers 6 Barbary horses against 6 French swords. Falstaff talks about fighting with the Barbary hen. Bassanio in Merchant of Venice talks about traveling merchants going to foreign lands, which include, quote, Tripoli, Mexico, England, Lisbon, Barbary, and India, end quote. There are also 5 additional references to Barbary horses throughout Shakespeare's plays. The Barbary States were Algeria, Tunisia, Tripoli, and Morocco. These were powerful coastal societies tied in various ways to the Ottoman world. And in Shakespeare's day, they were central to English fears about piracy and captivity. Ships were being seized, sailors were enslaved, families, merchants, churches, and governments negotiated over the price of a human life. Today, we're joined by Daniel Vitkus, editor of Piracy, Slavery, and Redemption, Barbary Captivity Narratives from Early Modern England, and Abdulhamit Arvas, associate professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania and expert on Muslims, Barbary, pirates, and Shakespeare. They're both here to help us explore the place of the Barbary Coast in Shakespeare's England, to understand the culture of hostages and holding someone ransom, what exactly was happening to Britons that were taken captive and sold into slavery by the Barbary pirates, as well as to explain the surprising dichotomy of being afraid of the Barbary naval force, as well as admiring their products like their horses. Remember that if you'd like to see visuals that coordinate with our conversation today, including images of the Barbary States from the 16th century, paintings of Turks and Ottomans, links to the captive narratives, and other research material that went into the making of our show today, you can scroll through all of these visual extras while you're listening to this show by joining us as a member of That Shakespeare Life. Visit the show notes for today's episode at CassidyCash.com/episode 431 and click on any of the membership buttons available there, or you can join us directly at patreon.com/That Shakespeare Life. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Dan. Hello, Hamit. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. It's good to be here.
Hello, Cassidy. It's great to be here. Thank you for having us.
Of Shakespeare's 9 uses of the word Barbary, the overwhelming majority, I think I counted 5 of these references, they are all talking about Barbary horses. Why were Barbary horses considered so valuable, and were they being imported to England in the 16th century? Were they fashionable at this time?
Yes, they were being imported to England, not in large numbers, but the horses that were being bred in North Africa had already gained a reputation for speed and strength and so on. So that was known, but at the same time, there's a lot of wordplay going on there involving the overdetermined meaning of the word Barbary, and that it refers to, North Africa as a region, that it's a play on the idea of barbarianism and a kind of, a negative attitude toward the Islamic other in North Africa. It can be used in different ways. But yes, the horses were a thing.
Of the other references to Barbary in Shakespeare's plays, there's one that I need to ask about because it seems so offbeat to me. Falstaff, now admittedly, we're talking Falstaff here, so he's not exactly trustworthy with his language, and he definitely loves to sling some sarcasm, but he mentions a Barbary chicken. I think he calls it a Barbary hen. The context from Henry IV, Part 2, is that Falstaff and Mistress Quickly are arguing over whether or not to let Pistol into her establishment, and Mistress Quickly says she doesn't want to because he causes trouble. And Falstaff defends Pistol by saying he wouldn't even start a fight with a Barbary hen. And the implication is that the Barbary hen is scrawny and foreign-looking and easy to beat, and this weak kind of image goes along with this context. Falstaff's obviously using Barbary as a slur here, but what was the general opinion in England of people from the Barbary States? Was this consistent with England's opinion of the Barbary part of the world?
I mean, here, Barbary hen, when Falstaff is talking, is either usually used for guinea fowl or turkey hen, thinking like these birds are coming through Turkey. Interestingly, we have another reference like this, which is Barbary cock pigeon in As You Like It. So, I mean, in these references, the bird is definitely not the horse, right? It is the kind of, I guess, imagine the lowest imaginable opponent for Pistol. So just like Dan mentioned, like the horse being this reliable kind of like import from Africa, but at the same time, when it's used for a person, it becomes this animalizing of the person, right? So when Othello is called Barbary horse, it is not about Othello's strength, but it is about animality and bestiality attributed to Othello's black body. So here, the bird is definitely not the horse, but Barbary bird evokes the same imagery of African exoticism or imports coming from Africa, but at the same time, it is animalizing, kind of like blackness, marking it outside Christian European order. So when we are thinking about how it is related to English opinions, I mean, there was no single English opinion of the Barbary States in Shakespeare's time. Attitudes were actually deeply ambivalent. So English people associated the Barbary State regions like Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, or Tripoli, or today's Libya, with several conflicting ideas all at once, including fear, coming from Barbary corsairs and pirates, we would call them today, that were raiding Christian ships or enslaving captives. But that fear was usually coming together with admiration of North African cavalry or diplomacy or luxury goods, the way Barbary horses sometimes celebrated, for example. And we know of Henry VIII had Barbary horses, right? And it was also like seen as a region related with kind of like commercial opportunity to kind of like build wealth in terms of especially exchange or import of sugar, saltpeter, or leather from the States, was also creating a different image of African in English mind, a kind of exotic fascination combined with slavery and blackness, especially. Like in late 16th century, perceptions are rather more ambivalent compared to mid 17th century and afterwards perception, when English really becomes one of, if not the most dominating power in piracy activities in the region. And these are all not only like fictional kind of like responses to fictional representations, but we know, for example, Moroccan convoys were in England multiple times in 1589, in 1595, and most famously 1600, when we have Abdulhamit bin Masood with at least 14 people for 2 weeks in London, walking in the streets of London, going to theater. So people see this graceful, African diplomats with kind of like golds and turbans and robes. So they have a kind of like a sense of what they look like. And around the same time in 1596, as well as 1601, Queen Elizabeth had decrees to expel quote unquote blackamoors from England, which gives us an impression that the number of North Africans in England must be higher than what we have estimated so far, as Imtiaz Habib made very clear in his book Black Lives in England, that there were quite a population of African peoples in London. So all this created these impressions and perceptions of them as the dangerously other, but at the same time, sometimes the respected, admired people of a region that they associated with wealth and exoticism.
Obviously, there's a lot of dichotomy happening here. And I think while Shakespeare's references could be described as an overgeneralized stereotype, I think, like most stereotypes, it's also pretty reflective of real historical events. For example, when I read about sailors on British vessels being taken captive by Barbary pirates, by these Barbary corsairs that you're mentioning, it sounds incredibly vicious and violent and specifically merciless. In fact, the whole affair starts to sound pretty much like human trafficking, where the Barbary States are trafficking British citizens in the 16th century. And I'm wondering if that's what was happening, and if so, who were the British citizens being sold to?
Right. No, it certainly is a form of human trafficking for sure. And it's part of a system of slavery, enslavement, capturing people, turning human beings into commodities and selling them throughout the Mediterranean. But it is not limited to the North African corsair ports. I mean, they are places where these so-called pirates or Barbary pirates are operating. Those are the bases for those corsairs, but those are places where they can do that legally. Really, the term pirates is a slur from the other side, from the European Christian side. They're actually legal corsairs. And similarly, the Europeans saw themselves as operating legally when they did very similar things. It wasn't just the corsairs sailing out of Tunis and Algiers who were engaged in human trafficking. It was something that was happening throughout the Mediterranean. It was something that was being done by Christians. There were slave markets in Italy and in other parts of the Christian parts of Mediterranean, if you want to call it that. So it was frightening, I think, for the common seamen who journeyed into the Mediterranean, who knew that this was a possibility, who knew that this was a danger, who were, putting their lives on the line, that they might end up in a slave market. But if you're talking specifically about the so-called Barbary pirates, the corsairs of the North African ports, like Algiers and Tunis and other places, they were markets there. It was a business. It was, they brought the people in. They would go out. There would be a kind of a group of people would sponsor and invest legally in a voyage. They would raise a crew. They would equip the ship, maybe multiple ships. They would venture forth. They would look for vulnerable targets that weren't too powerful for them, and often the ships went in convoys to prevent that. And then they would attack and ask for those ships to surrender. If they didn't surrender, they might push it and attack violently and board the ship violently if necessary. Sometimes people who were attacked successfully fought off the corsairs' onslaught. So it was vicious and violent, merciless, not in the sense that you don't want to. You want to capture living people that you can sell. So you don't want to kill them. You much prefer to threaten them and get them to surrender, just to pull up and threaten to bombard them and get them to surrender peacefully, And so I don't know if that's a mild form of mercy, but it's in the interest of making money. And that's what it was all about. So they would take the crew, they would try to interrogate them to find out who they thought might have a family that could pay a higher ransom. They could try to determine that. They had sort of their methods for doing so. They would bring the people back to the slave markets. They would be held there. They'd be put on sale. A certain number of the captives would be given to the local leaders as a kind of quota that went to the local government. So it was all a legal business, but surely it was cruel. And surely to any kind of human trafficking, any kind of enslavement of people is cruel in that sense. Yeah.
And if I may add, Dan, it's so important what you kind of like reminded that it was England and other European nations were also stealing human and trafficking. And the difference maybe is the conception of the slavery between European states and this region, right? I mean, in Arabic, the two words for slaves are different. One is abd, ubudiyya, which is what we would call slave. The other one is esir. So which is more related to these captives, right? As Dan mentioned, you have to take care of them if you want to ransom. You are going to make money out of them. So they are not the same slave status Abid people would be. Whereas those Muslims who were stolen by Europeans and then sold at the slave market, say in Genoa, in Venice, in Nepal, or in Barcelona, or in Valencia, they were more put in what we would consider slave category, which would be even more merciless, and then some shipped away to Americas, right? So there is like a different way in terms of when we're thinking about merciless and cruelty associated with captives versus slaves who were like permanently kind of like status as an object and property.
Was it a goal of the Islamic countries to capture travelers and convert them to Islam? And what would happen to the captives if they didn't convert to Islam?
Conversion was a significant component, but really the captivity in the Mediterranean was a part of a wider web of ransom and labor system as practiced by Christian and Muslim states alike. So conversion surely was sometimes encouraged, but it was not usually the primary goal of Barbary corsair raids. If everyone converted, then you wouldn't have any laborer, right? You need people in this labor system and then in this ransom structure. So main objective of these corsairs were mainly, profit through ransom or slave labor or political leverage, as well as maritime warfare. But that said, conversion to Islam could surely improve a captive's situation dramatically, right? They can gain their freedom, enter military or naval service, rise socially, and become a part of the local society. So we know a number of European captives became prominent corsairs themselves or Ottoman officials after converting. For example, and English writers, and in the period, they called such people renegades. For example, Hasan Aga, who was born as Samson Rowley, the son of Francis Rowley of Bristol, who was captured and then willingly converted and was renamed as Hassan, and who was castrated to become a eunuch. Then he held one of the most powerful positions as treasurer to the ruler of Algiers, Uluç Ali Aga, or Uluç Ali Pasha, who himself was an Italian privateer, then fell into slavery as a galley slave and then converted and became the commander of Algiers and the Ottoman fleet. So many Muslim corsairs were slaves and converted to Islam, then have this power, which English British authorities like William Harborne, the ambassador to Turkey, would negotiate with Hasan Aga to save other English captives and speaking in English using the common kind of background that they have. Or we have the accounts about John Ward, who Robert Darbourne's A Christian Turned Turk is about, that John Ward converted to Islam and took the name, I think, of Joseph Wardia, I guess, and became a prominent kind of like corsair that English theater makers started to imagine him as a renegade and represented on theater stage. So if captives didn't convert, they were generally not executed just for simply remaining Christians, but they would continue to act as slaves and in galley rowers and as laborers or as domestic servants, or just ransom captives until either they got their freedom, if they got the ransom, or they would just be waiting until they die in captivity. And we also have some accounts about women becoming kind of like really higher positions in harems. There are like mentioning of an English queen, for example, even, who becomes kind of like the leader of the harem, if I may translate it. But I mean, if we think about the conversion again, religion mattered for sure, greatly. And conversion could change the legal and social status in ways we can say the way it was impossible in the Atlantic slave system. So it operated that with the conversion, they may gain their freedom and become a part of the local life in the region.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, in terms of their motives, the Islamic countries that were sending out these voyages to capture people, their motive was financial. They were going out to get something to capture and sell, and they weren't really motivated by trying to go out and convert people to Islam. But if the people being taken captive wanted any hope of escaping the slavery they had now been captured into or being sold at the slave market, conversion to Islam offered them an opportunity that they wouldn't have had otherwise.
Exactly. And we should also remember many of these corsairs in North Africa came from Spain after expulsion of Moriscos and Muslims and Jews. And they find themselves in North Africa. And these are the corsairs who were like acting. And then they had really huge anger against Spain, especially, and the larger Christian world. There was the Islamic discourse of Gaza. So they would be associated with those who are fighting for Islam, who are trying to redeem for Islam. But deep down, these were merchants, right? In a way, they were all having license, and then they would take a ship with the people as captive, and they would approach to certain ports to sell them and make money. And then after that, those people would give the options. If they convert to Islam, they may have their freedom. If not, they can just act or continue and kept for ransom or as laborer, etc.
When an English family received word that someone had been taken captive by Barbary pirates, what happened next? And how often did the captives make it back home?
I think that's difficult to measure. Some scholars and historians have tried to do that. People like Robert C. Davis and Nabil Matar try to look at the numbers of captives and how many returned home. And certainly some simply never came home and were never heard from again, particularly those that were perhaps taken by the Sultan and put to work as laborers for the Sultan of Morocco, for example, working on building his palaces and other kinds of projects like that. They might never be heard from again. It was when the captive was brought back to Algiers or Morocco or Tunis, and kind of an evaluation was made, an interview process, if you will, to find out, what kind of family are they from. And they would look at their clothes and their belongings to try to look at their letters. And as Hamid said, there were people there in these places who spoke all the different languages. It's an extremely multicultural environment, very sophisticated, mercantile environment. So they had ways of figuring these things out. And if they found out this was, this person seems to come from a fairly well-to-do family, then they would start sending letters back. And it's interesting, these letters become formulaic, and they are written actually not even by the captives. So it's kind of a hostage situation where the letter is written by somebody else, and then they sign it off and it gets sent to their family. And the letters say things like, I am here in terrible captivity among the Muslims, and they are, the beatings are terrible, and my life is miserable. I beg you, my beloved family, to please save me from this terrible fate. And so this kind of formulaic letters go back. I think in some cases there would be, a unique letter written, but there was also this kind of common way of doing it. And then, there was a question as to whether the family could raise the money and if they actually did have the resources. And sometimes the corsairs who were seeking the ransom held out for a high ransom, and they felt that the family could pay. This was the case of Cervantes when he was taken captive after a battle in the Mediterranean. The great Spanish author who was held in captivity for many years in Algiers. They thought he had a lot of money, and in fact he was an impoverished writer who really had very little to be obtained from his family back home. So he languished for years in captivity until the court finally did step in, and there was some patronage that was used to raise the ransom for him. So I think it varied quite a bit, and there were middlemen who acted as go-betweens to carry the ransom payments back and forth. For the English, this tended to be merchants. For the Spanish and Italians and others, there were particular orders of mendicant friars, the Redemptionist order, and they were established for the charitable purpose of redeeming captives. And redeeming captives was considered to be one of the 7 great works of mercy, the antidote to the 7 deadly sins. One of them is the redemption of captives. So it's considered this great holy work and charity. So entire orders of priests were created for the purpose of negotiating ransom with people who had been taken captive. And that's an interesting thing too in terms of the economics, because in a way, it created a system that encouraged captive taking. He kind of made it kept this engine of payment, this kind of economic system running more efficiently by having people who would facilitate the process and make it happen and make sure the payments got there.
I don't know whether to call that a double-edged sword or a catch-22, because you'd want them to be going after, you feel bad immediately for the people that are captured and have no way to pay their way back home. And you're glad that there's a redemptionist order of friars that are like, we're coming for them. We're going to go and get them. And then knowing that just encourages someone to do it again. That's a horrible situation. What are some examples of captivity narratives with the Barbary pirates that still survive from the 16th and 17th century? And what do these narratives have in common for describing their experience of the people that were taken captive?
I mean, one of the greatest sources from the period that we have, the letters that Dan mentioned, as well as some other Barbary narratives, is Richard Hakluyt's Principal Navigations. First, as a great collection, it's probably the first and most comprehensive collections of voyages in the period, first put together in 1589 and later in an expanded version in 1599, has so many examples from the period. And here I would mention Dan Vitkus's great book on piracy, which gives us amazing examples. Some of the samples on this, Barbary Captivity, not only letters and narratives, but also ballads and other forms of writings. Some popular accounts are those of like John Fox or John Rowlands or William Davis, Thomas Sanders, or an English merchant who is named as T.S. with the letters only. We don't know who that person really is. So they were really a popular form of writing in the period. When we look at overall common threads, they tend to share several recurring points. One is almost every single one of them insists on true, the most true and loyal account. And if something is really claiming to be most true, I always get more suspicious that probably it's not true. And because the way Dan mentioned, most of these narratives can be formulaic. And especially when we look at the captivity narratives, they are mostly shaped by this Protestant anti-Islamic polemics and sensationalism and revealing English fears about religious and national vulnerability. And also there is like this commercial publishing. They are a part of commercial publishing, so they are written to be sold. So there is this kind of like element of claiming truth as a part of the narrative there. One main thing is fear of conversion is there. They are usually portraying Islam as a constant spiritual threat and even more frightening than spiritual suffering. And there's this huge anxiety, what they would say, turning Turk, and the resistance against turning Turk as a part of these narratives, because as I mentioned earlier, the renegades, the converts, the renegados, usually appear in English imaginations as tragic or corrupt or morally ambiguous figures who kind of like regret to be convert, which is not the case, right? I mean, when we are looking at the Christian turned Turk, John Ward dies, whereas when the play was staged, he was still alive and enjoying luxurious, rich life in North Africa. Another common thread is really the description of hard labor and punishment. Like many recount rowing galleys, hard labors, beatings, imprisonment, and tough conditions that would create especially sympathy for ransom. As Dan mentioned, some of these letters feel like they were dictated or written by scribes. They try to use the letters to get ransom, so to scandalize the public, receiving public, that they have sympathy and then they can collect money for ransom in this ransom culture. Another point of such narratives is there's this exotic fascination. As we mentioned, there are like so much details about North African cities, customs, how they dress, their courts, the gender dynamic, and especially related to gender, sexuality. appears as a striking component of many of these narratives, that these people of Africa are represented, associated with sodomy, right? And transgressive sexual acts. And all this kind of like fascination for the details of the culture is created in a tension with the sodomitical fear that every man, every boy, and even some representations talk about women being sodomized. So sexuality is a huge anxiety in that sense. But also there's the recurring theme of Muslim women, Muslim and Jewish women, especially in the area, being so attracted to Christian men. So they also kind of celebrate themselves, like especially the account of the adventures of T.S., for example. All he talks about how men and women alike are always attracted to him and wants to sleep with him. So there's like this praisal of their sexual attraction for Muslim and Jewish women especially. But interestingly, despite all the fear and exoticism these accounts create, they usually end with the providence and redemption, right? So they are always talking about how they survived and how their return is an evidence of divine intervention. So they create a promise for the ongoing English dream and envisioning of this imperial and colonial activities despite the risks and fear. These narratives really became so popular, and especially creating the image of kind of like this Barbary captives as a threat is one of the reasons that Nabil Matar claims provoked even or contributed to emergence of civil war, when Charles didn't really take into account the demand of the public to save these captives as much as public demanded him to do. And later centuries, they are going to revive, especially in early American context. They are going to become really popular in the early United States. That Greta Lafleur recently wrote a book, how these narratives really contributed to emergence of modern sexuality in early America. So they are really influential piece of writing that shaped not only English, but beyond English, later American imaginations regarding North Africa.
I mean, I think Hamit's right about the continuing importance of Barbary captivity narratives, so-called Barbary captivity narratives, over time on into the 19th century. But also, if you go back and consider that the previous literary traditions that they're drawing on, which I think he alluded to, but I think that's also important. And here might be a way to connect to the literary and to Shakespeare's and to drama as well, is that, this idea of the captive's tale of a Christian knight taken captive by Muslim forces and held in captivity is a very old story that goes back to medieval romance tales. And part of it is one of the things that Hamid mentioned, the idea of the virtuous Muslim princess who is attracted to the Christian captive and helps him escape. This goes back to that medieval romance narrative that goes into the past, to the time of the Crusades, and to that experience of the cultural interactions then. So taking that all forward into the captivity narratives that are published as true stories, although highly embellished and sensationalized in the way he described, these things are then sometimes translated on the stage in Shakespeare's time. And Hamid mentioned he mentioned a Christian turned Turk, Robert Dayborn's play, which is an interesting example of that. But there are others like Massinger's The Renegado. In Shakespeare, you find isolated references to Turks and Moors. And I think that's also important as well, is this understanding of what it is to be a Moor and the fear of a kind of blackness that is, a sexual threat, but also associated with the military power and the maritime power and the threat of Muslim corsairs and Ottoman armies and all the rest of it in the Mediterranean world, because it's during Shakespeare's time that the English are really starting to send their own vessels increasingly into the Mediterranean world, starting in the 1560s and 1570s, whereas before that, they really hadn't been doing that very much. And so this leads to increased contact with those cultures. It leads to more frequent incidents of being taken captive, of English subjects being taken captive. But I mean, all that does translate into references and allusions on the stage to Turks and Moors that are part of the excitement and the, exotic Mediterranean world that gets represented in so many plays during Shakespeare's time, including, so many of Shakespeare's own plays that are set in the Mediterranean world.
When we're focusing on the Britons getting taken captive, I think we miss the fact that during this same time period, not all British who ended up in North Africa were there because they were captives. In fact, quoting from the work Dan edited on Barbary, pirates, and slavery, quote, in the early 17th century, there were so many European immigrants to Algiers that they formed what was called a lobby. And by the end of the 1620s, there were more Britons in Northern Africa than in North America, end quote. Dan, why were so many Britons trying to get to North Africa at this time?
So the primary reason is what we've been discussing. It's to make money. It is in economic motives, either in terms of merchant activities that are taking off in the time of England's expansion and its early globalization and the rise of emergent forms of capitalism and long distance trade. So that's the engine that's driving all this history and this cultural interaction, and a lot of the conflict and violence too that arises from that is from the search for profits through long distance maritime trade. And what I was just saying about the English wanting to be active in the Mediterranean themselves, they're founding their own joint stock investment corporations to raise money, Levant Company, later the East India Company, and others to get the investment behind this expansion of commercial activity into the Mediterranean. So they're going there for that reason, because there's money to be made by trading in those ports in North Africa and with the Ottomans as well. It's interesting because you might find, English merchants coming to peacefully trade and openly trade in Algiers at the same time as there would be enslaved persons from England in the port that they might encounter on the streets of the city of Algiers. Those things could be going on at the same time. It would be bad for business for the Algerians to suddenly grab and confiscate an English ship that was trading peacefully in the port of Algiers. So this was going on at the same time. So the other motive, I think, is something we already talked about a little bit, which is that for some people who came to North Africa from miserable, marginal, rainy, impoverished, class-bound English society, they looked around when they got there, and if they had the opportunity, maybe they had a master who treated them well, maybe they had an opportunity to convert, and they said, wow, I like it here. The weather is better. I can do better here. I can do well as a corsair here. I'm gonna convert. I'm gonna stay here. So there's individual economic motivation as well.
Unlike the Britons who came to North America in the 1620s and started British colonies there, living in North Africa and settling in countries like Algiers or Tunisia would require converting to Islam. And we've mentioned that this whole process was called turning Turk, but I want to call attention to the fact that Shakespeare references this phrase exactly, and he uses it at least 3 times in his plays, indicating that this was a relevant idea back in London for Shakespeare's lifetime. And in 1644, Samuel Hartlib speaks out against this conversion, listing it alongside murder to describe his negative opinion of turning Turk. Given the religious tensions in England and the reputation of Barbary pirates for stealing English citizens at sea, and England's own reputation globally as a Christian nation at this time, which it was trying very fiercely to defend, how was it possible that the English crown was choosing to finance or approve the travel documents that would have been necessary for these Britons to immigrate to North Africa in the first place?
Early modern states were actually far more pragmatic than later nationalist narratives sometimes suggest. So Elizabethan and early Stuart England, they saw the Islamic Mediterranean not only as a religious threat, but also as a major commercial and diplomatic opportunity, as Dan just mentioned, right? England in the 16th century was actually relatively weak and economically ambitious, and they were competing with Catholic Spain. So England's reputation globally, yes, as a Christian nation, but primarily it was one that was excommunicated, with Elizabeth being excommunicated by the Pope. So it was actually a Protestant one. And Protestant Englishmen, they sometimes found a more welcoming space in North Africa than their encounters with Catholic France and Spain. So English and Scottish ships, they would be deployed for business, for example, by North African tradesmen. But also, they didn't really have to convert to Islam to do business or to settle there, because there was a different embrace of people of books as traders in these Islamic societies. And we see then the Protestant Englishmen see it easier to trade and have relations with Muslims in the region than Catholics elsewhere. As we see even the letter exchange between Queen Elizabeth and then Muhammad al-Mutawakkil, who was the Moroccan ruler, they are talking about the commonalities between people of book. So there's this understanding of imagining Protestantism closer to Islam in persuading this Islamic ruler to give them license and enable them easier trade market. So Catholic hostility, when that pushed English crown into alliances and trade agreements with Muslim powers, especially Morocco and the Ottoman Empire, then the crown really enabled the licenses and passports and charters to trade, because it's also benefit from customs revenue. It benefits from strategic alliances against Spain. It has access to Mediterranean commerce and get the naval intelligence. And all of them will eventually enable England become one of the most dominant naval power in the Mediterranean when we came to the late 17th century. So yeah, while turning Turk was publicly condemned as apostasy or ordinary contact with Muslim states was really officially tolerated and sometimes actively encouraged when it benefited English trade and foreign policy. So I remember a number, I may be wrong, Dan would correct me, like any given time in late 16th, early 17th century, there would be around 20,000 Britons, British people living in this Barbary States and kind of like, trading and having encounters with Muslims there. So religious hostility overall did not really prevent diplomatic realism. I think the commerce and geopolitics really often outweighed then, as it is now, the religious or confessional ideology.
It sounds like England was really taking the attitude of, the enemy of my enemy is my friend when it was coming to North Africa. They don't like Catholic Spain and we don't like Catholic Spain, and that's our primary goal. So we're going to find a way to function here with the religious conflicts that were there.
Yes, I think they took that pretty far in some cases, where there are pretty well documented reports that there were negotiations between Elizabeth I and the Moroccan Sultan to form an alliance. And they were even talking about possible joint invasion activities and attacks on Spain. This is like during the era of the Spanish Armada, a peak period of conflict between English Protestantism and Spanish Roman Catholicism under the rulers of Spain. So they did that. They were allies of the Moroccan Sultan for quite a long time, including during that time that the diplomatic group came to London in the early 17th century. So they didn't just think about it. That was actually active geopolitics that was going on. And I also think it's important to stress something that Hamid mentioned, that the Christendom is much more intolerant. I mean, the church did not tolerate Islam, did not tolerate Judaism. When Spain was conquered by the Spanish monarchs and Granada fell in 1492, it wasn't long before there was, forced conversion and driving out of all these people who left Spain, who were Muslim or Jewish, and who went to North Africa or went to the Ottoman Empire, where they were received. And they were received in the Ottoman Empire. Jews, Muslims, and Christians were all tolerated and allowed to practice openly their religion. Not the case in Christendom, right? Especially after the Reformation. So particularly that Islam would not be tolerated. Obviously, there were Jewish communities throughout the medieval period in Europe and onward. And then that thing that ties Protestantism close together with Islam, yet another thing is that this idea that Protestantism was a form of Christianity that was very much opposed to image worship. And this was seen as a compatibility with the prohibition on the use of images in religious practice that is associated with Islam. So that was seen as an area of compatibility as opposed to Roman Catholic use of a lot of images in their religious practice.
In the work Dan edited, the writers note that England had very little first-hand information about the Ottomans or the Moors before Richard Knolles published The History of the Turks, which came out in 1603. Now, Shakespeare had already used the phrase turn Turk before 1603, but Othello, with its Moorish title character and references to Turks, Ottomans, and Cyprus, appears around this same moment when Richard Knolles' book has been published. Dan and Hamid, are you aware of whether Shakespeare was responding directly to Knolles' book, or is this all just coincidental or maybe just reflective, I guess would be a better word, of the time frame that Shakespeare is writing in here? Is he responding to that book in particular, or was English interest in the Ottoman and North African world just matching up at this time?
I don't know if we can trace, maybe it's possible to trace very specific connections to Knolles' book. It was certainly a very important and popular book. It's true that there aren't a lot of detailed texts that focus entirely on the Ottoman Turks up until that time. But I wouldn't want to overestimate its importance as an influence on Shakespeare or otherwise. Many publications, during the Elizabethan period leading up to that time include all kinds of information about the Ottoman Empire, about the Turkish court. I mean, there was a lot of interest in that. There's this kind of, proto-Orientalist interest. And I think it picked up earlier, as I said before, it's when the English start to really mount their own voyages into the Mediterranean on a larger scale, on a regular basis. And imagine that. I mean, London is a port city. The common seamen, the sailors, the ship captains, the merchants involved in that, they're all involved in these voyages that go from London to the Mediterranean and back. And once that starts to really take off in the 1560s and then the 1570s, and it increases after that time, there's just so much cultural interaction. There's so much information going back and forth. So it's not like suddenly, Knolles' book breaks on the scene like some kind of massive revelation. I think it was an important book, and it is an interesting text to look at. I think Shakespeare's Othello is responding to lots of other things going on, many things that were just happening in the culture and in the movement of people and the interaction between the English and other cultures in the Mediterranean.
I agree that kind of Knolles' book was not the only one for sure, but also it was published in 1603, around the same time as Othello was staged, probably 1604. But this doesn't mean parts of books were not already circulating, right? And one thing we think Knolles might be influential source for Shakespeare is the description of the conquest of Cyprus by the Ottomans in 1571. So these are some of the historical knowledges that Shakespeare might have gotten from parts of the Knolles' book. But as Dan mentioned, there are tons of other translated, especially from Italian and French sources that were already circulating in the period, which caused what Dan Vitkus has termed as Turk play, right? There's a whole wave of plays about Turks from 1580s to 1620s, almost more than 60 plays in 40 years were staged on commercial stage about the Turks, Islam, and Muslims. But another source relatedly I would love to mention is Leo Africanus's description of Africa, which was translated into English by John Pori in 1600, right before Shakespeare is writing Othello. This is a work by a North African diplomat, Hassan al-Wazan, who was captured by Spanish pirates as he was coming back from an diplomatic mission with the Ottoman Empire. So he was captured and enslaved and gifted to Pope as a slave. But once they realized how educated he is, how trained he is in diplomacy, in Islam, in many other realms, then the Pope, we don't know if he was forced to convert, but he converted to Christianity and took the name of Leo given by Pope Leo X. So Leo Africanus's description of Africa is the first full account of Africa by an African printed and published in Europe and became very popular. And some references, we have some scholarship on how Othello, Shakespeare might have relied on this account, imagining Othello, who himself talks about him being sold to slavery, right? So there is like this, not only people who are turning Turks, but also Muslims who are enslaved and brought to the Europe and function in various status. And here, I think Shakespeare's imagination of Othello as an African in Venice who becomes the general is kind of like might have used sources like Leo Africanus's description of Africa as well.
There's a whole lot to explore about the Barbary pirates and the relationship of England and the Ottoman Empire, and even just the history behind Shakespeare's Othello and what could have inspired that. If we are excited to learn more about this topic from your research into this subject, what are some reliable resources you can recommend for us to start with if we want to explore more?
I mean, there's a rich scholarship on this already. And if I have to pick two titles, I think besides Dan's books, I think I would say Nabil Matar's Britain and Barbary is a great book, not only given all the historical context, but also putting some English dramatic text in that context of piracy is a great source. And second, there's a more recent book by a Turkish academic, Emrah Safa Gürkan, which is a book called Sultan'ın Korsanları, which might be translated as Pirates for Sultan. So I'm not sure if it has been translated into English yet, but I am sure it would be very soon. It's an amazing resource giving us the Ottoman perspective and Ottoman side of this piracy in the Mediterranean, and talking about anything from economics to geography to what was happening in this ship. So it's this amazing source. Hopefully would be translated into English very soon.
I would recommend Jerry Broughton's book, This Orient Isle, as that kind of book. It's very accessible, but it's also learned at the same time. And he's written a lot of other things as well along these lines. The other book I might recommend would be Nabil Matar and Gerald McLean's book that they co-authored, Britain and the Islamic World, which again is a kind of a broad survey of the cultural exchange and knowledge production that went on for quite a while back and forth between Britain and the Islamic world.
Both of our guests this week, Dan and Hamit, have written books on Barbary pirates and the Ottoman Empire and this level of history, which we will link you to. And they are both founts of knowledge in the topic of the Ottoman Empire, Islam, and the Shakespeare's lifetime and how all of that overlaps for the 16th and early 17th century. So in addition to these books they've recommended, they each provided more resources for you to explore this topic further. And I will place links to the entire library of suggestions in the show notes today. So make sure you stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Now, Dan and Amit, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and you can each make a selection. But my friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. But your question is, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island?
I have an easy answer to that. I have no hesitation. It would be the greatest long poem ever written in the English language. It would be Milton's Paradise Lost.
Well, that would be a perfect selection for a desert island, I think, because you would be indeed in your own paradise lost at that time.
Yes, I would be lost at least. That's for sure.
Hamid, what would you take with you to your deserted island?
I assume besides a copy of Bible, I would be allowed a copy of Quran, so as well. But I think I would pick Ovid's Metamorphoses to read all the exciting poetry and the transformations that would make me daydream in an island. Yeah, Ovid's Metamorphoses would be my choice.
I think that's a good choice. If you're going to be stuck on an island, you need to be entertained as well as keep your mind sharp. So that's a good blend of both. Well, what's next for you both? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I maintain an interest in early modern representations of Islamic culture, but my main focus in recent years has shifted a little bit to some other matters. Well, because I got interested in the kinds of things I've been talking about today involving English expansion and contact with the Mediterranean and the Islamic world, I started to think about the Western expansion of the empires in general. So I'm interested in the sort of cultural implications during the 16th and 17th century of those imperial expansions, and not just the English, but also the Spanish and the French and others and the Dutch. And also I'm very much interested in eco-criticism these days, and looking at the origins of capitalism as much as that is also the story of the origins of our destruction of this planet through unsustainable economic activity. So that's another interest of mine these days.
So just a few light projects for you then.
Empire and planetary destruction, that's it. But also there's always a utopian hope element involved in that, and the idea that by understanding what went wrong, we also at the same time yearn for, imagine through the literary, a better world.
Hamid, what are you working on now that you're excited about?
I am currently working on my second book that is titled The Grammar of the Other, which traces how the translation from Islamic world, especially Arabic, Farsi, and Turkish translations, impacted and influenced the formulations of sexual categories and gender binarism in Europe. So in my first book, I was specifically looking at the Ottoman and English encounters, whereas in this book, I am extending this into a more larger Islamic and European relationality to trace the transformations in discourses of sexuality and gender, which would lead to the history of sexuality in the West, which I claim in the book is a problem of translation and as a result of transnational contact.
Some in-depth and exciting work coming forward from you both. We wish you both the best with your upcoming projects, and we will link to the professional websites for both our guests this week. So if you're interested in their upcoming projects and want to know when that's available to engage with, you can definitely follow them there to find out more. Dan, Hamid, thank you so much for being here today. This has been a really great conversation. I've enjoyed getting to take this in-depth look at the history of Barbary pirates, Islam, and the Ottoman world in Shakespeare's lifetime with you both. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to be here. I have enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you, Cassidy, for hosting us. It was a great pleasure to be in the company of Dan, who is a dear colleague and friend.
Yes, likewise. It's always a pleasure to be working with Hamid on anything, and I really appreciated all the good questions and the energy, and it's a pleasure to be on this show.
Well, thank you very much. All of the resources we've talked about in the show today, including more information on Daniel and Amit and their work and their projects that they've been talking about, along with all of the resources they recommend for you today, along with some of our other episodes, including one on the Siege of Famagusta, the Battle of Lepanto, and the Ottoman Turks. So if you want to explore even more Turkish, Ottoman, and Islamic history from Shakespeare's lifetime, the place to be is CassidyCash.com/episode 431. Remember, if you want to go even more in depth into the history with some visual extras, join us over in the membership area by clicking any of the membership buttons from the show notes page. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP431. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.
Most of us are one good deal away from finally replacing that worn-out rug, fixing up the backyard, or getting the bedroom we actually want. Good news, that deal's almost here. Wayfair's Black Friday and July sale. Get up to 80% off area rugs and up to 60% off outdoor and bedroom furniture. Shop Wayfair's huge selection of styles and find the piece to fit your style, budget, and space. Plus, free shipping. Black Friday in July ends July 27th. Shop today at wayfair.com.
Wayfair, every style, every home.